Hello everyone, and welcome back to our video course on Divine Liturgy. Now, my friends, we have almost reached the central part of Divine Liturgy, the Eucharistic prayer or anaphora, which will begin right after the Creed when the deacon says, "Let us stand aright, let us stand in awe, stomen kalos, stomen metaphovo, or staniem dobria, staniem so strachom." And the choir and people will respond, "A mercy of peace, Elion Irenis, or Miles Mira." But before we discuss that central Eucharistic prayer, we do have one final little moment to talk about, and that is the custom of the priest or priests waving or shaking the ayer, that is the large veil covering, known in Slavonic as the vazduch, that covers the chalice, and the discus or paten. It is the custom of waving this large cloth over the gifts during the Creed. And then the priest will fold this veil, kiss it, and lay it aside on the altar table, so that now you see the gifts are uncovered, because that's how they're supposed to be for the Eucharistic prayer. Now, in the Slavonic liturgical books, like this Služebnik, printed in Moscow, I believe in 2005, it says that the waving of the ayer is done throughout the Creed, and when it ends, see, this is the way the Russians usually do it, when it ends, the priest simply kisses it and lays it aside. But in the Greek books, one often finds, like in this one, and this is printed in Brookline, Massachusetts in 2015, in this edition it's Greek and English, we find that there's an additional detail or rubric that when the priest gets to the words in the Creed, "He was crucified for us," he makes the sign of the cross over the gifts with the ayer. And then he withdraws it and folds it and kisses it and then lays it aside. So we see here an example of a practical action, the removal of the veil over the gifts before the Eucharistic prayer. That's a practical purpose, yes, of that action. We see this initially practical action later further ritualized in various ways and also theologized about, with symbolic or allegorical interpretations attached to that originally practical action of removing the ayer from the gifts. In just a moment, we'll get to the symbolic meaning. But to give you a little bit of history about this business of waving or shaking the ayer, or raising and lowering it in any event, we find it in Byzantine euchologies from the 10th century on. It's not ubiquitous yet, but that's where we begin to see it in Byzantium. But originally it happened right after the Creed. The raising and lowering of the ayer was done after the Creed and not during it. In the 10th century, and also still in the 12th century, in Byzantine manuscripts, it was raised and lowered 3 times over the gifts, right after the Creed, as I said, and then it was removed. Our earliest Byzantine witness to doing anything with this ayer during the Creed is Saint Simeon of Thessalonica of the early 15th century, but Saint Simeon tells us that what was done with the ayer during the Creed was that it was simply held over the gifts, with no waving or shaking involved. Our first witness to this waving of the ayer, if you'll bear with me, I just want to give you some historical fun facts. The waving of the ayer is found in the later 15th century in a manuscript, a Sinai manuscript called Codex Sinai, Greek 986, if you wanted to know that. But in most places throughout the Byzantine realm, even as the waving of the ayer became customary throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, this custom is spreading, this was done briefly right after the Creed and not during it. That's my point here. And it was not until the 19th century, that late, yes, it was not until the 19th century that the practice of doing this during the Creed became ubiquitous. But where does this custom originate, you're asking perhaps, and what was it supposed to mean? Well, it originates in Syria, so think Antioch, that great liturgical center of Syria. Our earliest commentator from there, and also first witness to the custom, witness to the meaning, the symbolic meaning of the custom, is Severus of Antioch. So that's early 6th century. Severus of Antioch, known, of course, as a condemned heretic. But anyway, Severus of Antioch of the early 6th century gives us a very interesting explanation of the lifting and lowering of the cover over the gifts just before the anaphora. Severus refers it to St. Peter's vision of the veil that came down from heaven, as described in Acts 10. You remember, perhaps, that St. Peter did receive this vision by which he was instructed to go and preach to the Gentiles in the house of Cornelius, because before that St. Peter was not preaching to non-Jews. And Severus writes that, just like that veil which St. Peter saw coming down from heaven, so does the raising and lowering of the veil over the gifts at liturgy show the perfect and divine gift of the Spirit which was shown to Peter to have included all nations, which descends from heaven upon all that is set forth, and consecrates and hallows it. So, as we see this raising and lowering of the ayer, my friends, we can be reminded that the gift of the Holy Spirit, called down by the Church in the Divine Liturgy, does indeed descend upon all that is set forth, and on all nations. That means all of us who set ourselves forth, or offer ourselves to be consecrated and hallowed. Now, you might have heard another allegorical interpretation of the waving of the ayer. For example, a later explanation that it symbolizes the earthquake that happened upon Christ's death on the cross. One also hears that it symbolizes simply the hovering of the Spirit above the waters at the beginning of Genesis. So it's symbolizing the Holy Spirit. So it's close to the interpretation we find in Severus. But in fact, it is often the case with various liturgical moments and their allegorical explanation that there is not only one allegorical explanation. By different commentators on liturgy, there will be reference made to different moments of salvation history, or even with reference to different ethical principles or moments on our journey or ascent to God. For example, St. Maximus the Confessor likes to refer various moments of liturgy to the ascetical ascent to God in his liturgical mystagogy. So you might wonder, what's the point of these interpretations when they might seem random? Well, I just want to address this in this video because we're talking about an allegorical interpretation. I think this is an understandable question. The point of the kind of cross-referencing that goes on in allegorical interpretation, the cross-referencing between moments of the liturgical celebration and certain truths of the whole mystery of our salvation, either from salvation history and its separate events, or from other branches of tradition, like the ascetical practice. The point of these explanations is simply to be an aid to prayer, to draw us into the whole world and vision of the mystery, the one mystery of God. Okay, so that's the point, that we use any motion in liturgy, anything that we're doing that might be purely practical, and so as not to have it distract us from the major purpose of all of this, we fill everything with this one meaning, and it helps us to keep our vision and our prayerful concentration. That's the point. It's an aid to prayer. But before I wrap this up today, I should also comment on the way the waving of the Ayer is done at the hierarchical celebration, that is, when a bishop is celebrating. What happens when a bishop is celebrating is that the concelebrating priests wave the Ayer over the head of the bishop, who is bowing his head under it as he stands before the altar table. And here's what Father Taft writes about this. Quote, "As for the practice of waving the Ayer over the head of the bishop at pontifical liturgy, we have been unable to find any precise reason for this bizarre custom." So that's typical of Taft. He's just very direct and honest about this. He calls it a bizarre custom. But Father Taft does hypothesize that probably because the Ayer was so big, perhaps that custom originates in the bishop needing to sort of duck as those who removed it were doing that. So the fact is, we don't know exactly why that's done. All right, that's it for today, and tune in next time when we shall begin, finally, to talk about the central Eucharistic prayer, or the anaphora.